Hi everyone, my name is Dan Wang. I'm the technology analyst at Gavekal Dragonomics, a global macro research firm based in Beijing and Hong Kong. Let's talk about semiconductors. I'll make three broad points right now. One is why it's so important for China to figure out semiconductors, and where China is very broadly on a few particular segments. Second, I'll talk about basically my relatively optimistic view that China can figure out a lot of capabilities in semiconductors. And then third, I'll take on the risk to my somewhat optimistic view that US export controls can cause some serious dent in China's efforts. So why is it that China wants to make semiconductors? I think there are two broad reasons here. The first is that China imports a lot of semiconductors. So China imports more semiconductors than it does crude oil by value. And so there is the security element that China needs to make sure that it can guarantee supply in case of shocks. And as we've seen this year when ZTE was put on, when the US government put a denial order on ZTE, and then also when Fujian Jinhua memory chip maker was added to the entity list, basically both of these firms were no longer going concerns because they lacked access to chips. A second broad reason that China needs to figure out semiconductors is that the leadership feels that it can't be a meaningful technological power if it can't really make the brains of electronics. So it really needs to figure out basically how to make semiconductors because this is how you make forward progress. So where's China doing on semiconductor in the semiconductor industry? It's pretty poorly. So the red bar here represents the total semiconductor consumption that China uses. So the end figure for 2017, our last year of available data, is that it had to consume $180 billion of semiconductors. Then the blue line here is how much domestic industry was able to produce, $65 billion. So the delta here represents the imports. So it's about 2/3 of its semiconductor consumption has to be imported. I think this really severely understates how weak China's semiconductor industry still is. By the MIIT's own calculation, about 95% of high-end chips that China uses has to be imported from abroad. So, and how is this represented by the actual capabilities of Chinese industry? I'll just tackle a few quick ones. China's just now beginning to have capabilities in developing memory chips. So NAND and DRAM, there's a couple of fabs in central China that China is building out now. Really, one of the big weaknesses is in manufacturing. So China needs to be able to manufacture the chips. This is one of the really tough parts. So the Chinese national champion here is SMIC, based in Shanghai. And it's quite a bit behind the market leader, TSMC, which is based in Taiwan. So TSMC, so SMIC is currently at 28 nanometers. We'll move to 14 nanometers this year. By comparison, TSMC reached that level about 5 years ago. So in the most generous interpretation, China is 5 years or roughly 2 generations behind the market leader, TSMC. China has a relatively more robust design sector when it comes to semiconductors. So Huawei's HiSilicon is quite in the lead here in these terms of mobile chips. There's a couple of AI chips whose names keep coming up. But when it comes to high-end logic, basically China does not really have a position. When it comes to Intel CPU, when it comes to NVIDIA's GPU, this is mostly an American concern. So it's not really doing too well here. So what's the response to persistent weakness in semiconductors? Well, we have an industrial plan, of course. This is made in China 2025. This is specifically the section that mentions the IC roadmap. I know this is way too small for anybody to see it, but I just wanted to display some sense of the scale and the sheer volume of details. This specifies everything from particular technologies that China wants to be able to figure out. This goes up until 2030. And this also includes industry sales and industry scale targets for basically the rough plan. Now, I'll share a basically relatively optimistic view that I have that China will develop a lot more capabilities in semiconductors, and this will rest on 4 broad points. The first point is that China's the market for a lot of electronics now are in China. So I think this is the most important slide in my deck. This is basically smartphone sales around the world. There's this faint red line that shows that basically in our last year of available data, Chinese smartphone brands sold about 45%, nearly half of all phones in the entire world. China has a major PC maker, Lenovo. China has making a lot of different types of electronics that include televisions and printers. Increasingly innovative electronics are now being conceived of and designed and manufactured in a place like Shenzhen. What does this all have to do with semiconductors? Well, these are all users of semiconductors. So semiconductors are inputs into all these different types of electronics, especially something like smartphones, which I would argue is the most important electronic today. And you combine the fact that a lot of these brands are Chinese, producing in China, with a political system that in which the government, the state, will go up to particular firms and say, we would like you to procure from X, Y, and Z. And then basically this is how you have the demand base, the early customers to really engage in the learning process. So this process of industrial learning is much easier now that China has the market. 20 years ago, China did sort of have a large electronic sector, but a lot of that consisted of Taiwanese brands like ASUS and Acer that were merely assembling in China. So those firms couldn't be bothered to purchase quite inferior Chinese chips. Another reason is that Moore's law seems to be slowing down. Now, a lot of people have predicted the death of Moore's law. I'm not interested in doing that today, but it does seem like Moore's law has been slowing down. Intel has had enormous public problems getting from 14 nanometers to 10 nanometers. The original timeline was for it to roll out in 2016. Now it's been pushed back to 2019. Firm like Global Foundries has rolled out, going any smaller than, I believe, 7 nanometers. And so if the broader sector is slowing down, then the Chinese firms have a bit more breathing room to really try to catch up. So that's a little bit of an easier factor for the Chinese. One more reason is that in the last 10 years, a lot of semiconductor innovations were driven by the smartphone. The chips became ever smaller and more complex. In the next 10 years, that may not be the same story going forward. So if we have the era of 5G and everything that you see will be chipped, from our chairs to our cups to our knives and forks, these are usually simple communications devices of the type that China can already make today. And so if the next 10 years becomes a little bit more of a volume game, well, who does better than China at volume? So that might be another favorable trend in China's direction. And then last, I'll say that China has a lot of capital to commit to this. The reason I didn't put this as my primary reason is that basically capital has been relatively unconstrained for China to figure out semiconductors for a really long time. It hasn't been all that successful. But it is worth mentioning that China is willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to develop a semiconductor industry. It regards this as kind of a national security issue. And it has this strategy now of going after people. So I'll offer some anecdata about this. When I visited the leading memory chip plant in Wuhan, the staff told me that half the hotel was made up of Korean engineers who all have their own private cars and who get to fly home to Seoul on the weekends. This is really how Japan acquired a lot of capabilities from how Korea caught up a lot of capabilities from experienced Japanese engineers. Chinese firms are going up to Taiwanese engineers and saying, whatever your salary is in Taiwan dollars, let's just put a yuan sign in front of that, effectively quintupling their salary, which is a pretty good proposition for engineers in Taiwan who may not have seen very much growth in the last couple of years. And of course, they're recruiting very actively within a 10-mile radius of this place in Silicon Valley. So that is worth mentioning that China is willing to spend quite a bit of capital to take on, try to develop semiconductor capabilities. So much for the optimistic view. What is the big risk to this view? It is export controls from the US. This is a picture of Fujian Jinhua. This is the firm, the memory chip maker that was added to the entity list earlier last year, and thus it was denied American equipment. And basically, right after that happened, the firm kind of folded, and there may not really have too much capabilities left. This is a picture from Bloomberg reporting. Basically, look how desolate this place has become. I think the only thing missing here is a tumbleweed that shows really how there's not that much there left. And this is really a really big, crucial US advantage here. The US semiconductor equipment firms supply a lot of the tooling for semiconductor companies all around the world. If China cannot acquire modern tooling, then it will have a really difficult time catching up on making cutting-edge semiconductors. So this will be pretty material. Now, my base case is that export control from the US will not be too severe, but this is really a low conviction view. I'm not willing to make a very strong call that the US will not enforce very heavy export controls. One of the, I think, interesting things when we saw with the case of Jinhua, the memory chip maker, was that the Department of Commerce explained its rationale for adding Jinhua to the entity list by saying that gains in Chinese production might threaten the long-term viability of US military suppliers. I think that's a reasonable concern given what China has done to industries like steel and solar panels, where it wrecked, added overcapacity to the entire market. On the other hand, this equation of economic security with national security, I think, is quite a big deal, and that justification could be invoked to export control any segment of Made in China 2025. The reason I have a somewhat optimistic view that export controls will not be too severe is if you look at the share of sales that semiconductor companies are making in China, this is pretty significant. For Qualcomm, the share in 2017 was 65%. For firms like Micron and Broadcom, it's on the order of 50%. For Intel and NVIDIA, it's about 25%. For the equipment makers, it's 15 to 20%. And I think there's still some limit that the US government is not willing, there's still some limit to the pain that the US government is willing to impose on its technology champions. If they lose quite a bit of sales in China the next year, they may not have profits. And they are making this argument that export controls is like squeezing sand. The harder you squeeze, the more of it leaks out. That this will accelerate China's efforts to develop semiconductors. On the other hand, it's really difficult to predict what this administration will do. It seems like they are not super receptive to listening to corporate concerns, especially when it comes to issues of national security. And I just spent a week in DC learning more about export controls. I think we will see a lot more coming out in terms of critical, emerging, or foundational technologies, such that it might really have to reorganize, trigger some reorgs in tech companies around here. So with that cheery message, I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for listening.
Great, Dan. Thank you very much. Please be seated. So while Margaret actually said Dan came from Hong Kong, I actually drove up from LA last night, but it was an adventure because Highway 5 was shut off completely. So I actually took an extra. Regularly, it's 6 hours. It took about 10 hours. So, but just to be here today. But I just wanted to say I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of Asia Society. Anyways, my name is Chuck Ng. I'm the moderator today. I'm also an investor. Actually, I'm an investor in Open, as well as I'm the president of Project Pai, Project Personal AI. So it's great to actually be here today and really have a distinguished panelist. In fact, Yongwei and Jack are two good friends from just a few months ago. We actually had the largest international conference at Berkeley. So it's like a reunion for us today, but it was really fantastic to additionally have both great to join us, and of course Dan. But I think we're going to start with just a quick introduction of each panelist. So maybe Jack, if you can start, we'll just go around. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chuck. My name is Jack McCauley. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley. I work at Jacobs Institute for Design Innovation. It's part of the Department of Engineering. Formerly, I was the co-founder of Oculus VR. I had a couple other startup companies that failed. Prior to that, I was the chief engineer on Guitar Hero, chief designer. I'm also an inventor, and the discussion here was about intellectual property. I have a lot of opinions on that. And I currently I have an R&D facility, private, that I do my own stuff in the East Bay. And I'm also one of the top 25 donors to UC Berkeley. And I'm an alumni. I came back there 2015 after fleeing there, 1985. And so I'm back involved with the university, and I have a philanthropy for education.
Well, thank you very much, Jack. I'm the head of the Alumni Association from China. So on behalf of the university, I want to say thank you. But Yongwei, please.
So my name is Yongwei Zhang, and although I grew up in China, but I came to US for my PhD degrees. Ever since my PhD, I worked in Silicon Valley for the past 20 plus years. And in 2013, BGI is one of the largest genomic companies in the world, acquired a Silicon Valley company called Complete Genomics. So after acquisition, I actually joined the Complete Genomics to become part of BGI family. So right now, I'm serving as a BGI Group VP in charge of all BGI Group business in Americas.
Great. Great, please.
Yeah, I run, founded and run 3 companies. Berkeley Sourcing Group is where I started in China. I've been living in China for 14 years. We have a team of 20 on the ground in Shenzhen, and in that time we've worked with over 1,000 early stage companies, helping them do development and manufacturing in the China ecosystem. As we got that going, we realized that there were still a lot of stumbling blocks with these hardware startups, so we created a global community called Hardware Massive. We have 43 chapters around the world that meet regularly and have our big conference, HardwareCon, which is just up the way here in Silicon Valley in Mountain View, coming up April 17th and 18th, where our theme this year, on our 6th year, will be how AI and these smart technologies are interacting with hardware to make hardware more relevant and more interesting.
Well, very good. And I think people already know Dan. So I think with that being said, I think there's really 3 aspects of what we're trying to touch base on today. And then with that, after that, I hope to really make it interactive. And we want to, please, for the audience, we want you guys to ask your questions as well. The first thing I'm going to start is really talking about kind of the concept of perceptions versus realities. And I think all these are practitioners, if you will. And I want to, maybe what we can do is, Dan and great, if you guys can start, really kind of talk a little bit about the common perceptions in the U.S. on Made in China 2025, and really what are the realities with respect to that, please, Dan.
So I'll make a quick point about some of the technologies covered in 2025. So I think we see that there have been some successes with Chinese industrial policy, and there's also been some failures. On the failures, I would say it's something like semiconductors, and then also with conventional automobiles. And then relative successes have included things like solar panels, wind turbines, high-speed rail. And I think going forward, if 2025 is successful, we've kind of written off solar panels and steel as this commoditized industry, and we don't care about it that much anymore. China could be targeting these sunrise industries like memory chips, electric vehicle batteries, OLED display panels that really, are kind of seen as industries of the future that China might commoditize today.
Great.
Yeah, we see a lot of clients and partners and hardware startups that come to us, and there's a lot of, I find a lot of blame kind of for their Chinese partner or supplier without a lot of understanding of what's behind that. There's a huge complex ecosystem, and for example, a lot of factories lose about 60% of their workforce every year. And if you don't have that understanding coming from the US side that these are the realities that are being dealt with over there, that it's hard to work, and it's definitely a misperception. The other thing, kind of fundamentally, I'd say at the philosophical level, is a big difference is we really have a long-term strategy thinking in the U.S. versus in China. It's very much a short-term game, and I like to use kind of the football analogy that we're strategizing for the touchdown, but in China they're strategizing for the first down, and those strategies can independently work very well, and they certainly do within their own cultures. But when you get 2 companies that are trying to work together to a common goal, those strategies can really break down quickly.
Well, actually, that's a great setup for us. The next question, which ultimately, we're here in Silicon Valley as an investor myself and as an educator, we very much care about people, and talent. And I think, we talked about earlier some of the things been discussed by some of our distinguished speakers. On that level, given we're in Silicon Valley, obviously at Stanford and Silicon Valley, and I want, both Jack and Yongwei to actually comment a bit more on, because you guys are both entrepreneurs. What do you see the differences between, Chinese and American entrepreneurs and the way how we do things? Jack?
Thanks. So I've been going to China for 20 years. Of that 20, I lived there for 10. And my job, working for various companies producing hardware, was running the production team and engineering and facilitating communication and so forth. 20 years ago, the quality of programmers and engineering staff and talent was very low. As a matter of fact, we did most of it in the States and then brought the guys over there to install it or do whatever to get production going. It's completely different now. I mean, I would say even at Oculus, some of the Chinese engineers we hired in South China were on par or better engineers and programmers than the people we had recruited in the States. That's a primary difference. That is not intellectually property theft. That's just education and familiarization with the technology. So that's the thing. And then, this 2025 thing, I'm just going to segue a little bit on that. It's actually a smart thing because the realization that you've got an aging population and a rising middle class. There's 400 million people that are considered middle class in China, means you have less people to do production, which generally come from rural areas. Young people working in a production line are 18, 19 years old. And it's really boring work. It's pretty dry. I think it's a realization that they're going to have to get away from that and move into more intellectual based products, AI and so forth. So, but to go back to what I said, Oculus, I'll tell you a little vignette here. At Oculus, we have 20 people there when we started, and we didn't have the staff and the ability to do a lot of the work, and so I took the product over to China, to a factory in front of mine. We did the IMU and some other key components, but most of that work was done in China. That's the truth. On the very first DK1, we did the first developer kit. So I relied on the Chinese staff and engineering significantly. It's all about finding the right factory too and the right partner over there. And those relationships I built over 20 years. It took a long time to build trust and friendship with people, key people, in order to get them to take on a risk with me. And they repeatedly did that. I would bring something in and they would make it and it would fail, and we'd bring another thing in and it would fail. And once in a while you get a hit though. And so I relied on the people there. I'll just say one more thing about education. That's what I do my philanthropic work on. And in the States, there's a shortage of high-skilled or skilled workers, not high-skilled, machine operators and so forth like that. We just can't produce enough of them. There's a big demand for them, skilled blue-collar jobs. And the vocational system and education is just falling apart, and we can't find people like that. We have to import engineers into the States because we can't produce enough of them. And the primary education system is in terrible shape. California has 44 out of 50 states. We're near the bottom for K through 12. What to do about that? That's something that isn't being addressed in Washington, to my knowledge. I mean, I hear a lot about, tariffs and all this other stuff, but we've got our own issues here, particularly with producing quality people. So, I think, in my view, that our government should be not worrying about what other people are doing, worry about what we're doing. And so that's it.
No, that's actually a really good point. I think, Jack, you mentioned about two key points, right? One being that, 20 years ago, people were different in terms of people's experiences and engineering and whatnot, coding, but we're fast catching up. Secondly is actually, China has first good education system, while we in the great state of California, we're rank, right, number 44 out of 50 in terms of the entire sort of education system ranking in the US. So actually interesting, right? Fundamentally, there's a really emphasis on education. And Yongwei is actually an example of that because you did your undergraduate and you came here for your graduate school. So Yongwei, please comment on that.
So I would completely agree with what Jack said. I happen to be living in South Bend in Saratoga. Actually served one term on the Saratoga School Union Board. So actually I run the school for 4 years. So I know firsthand how broke the system is in California. But I'm coming back to Chuck's question, that what do I see the difference between Chinese entrepreneurs and the US entrepreneurs. And in first my 20 years in Silicon Valley, I worked in a startup in Silicon Valley. I co-founded 2 different companies, both of them failed. And then I worked for past 5 years in Shenzhen. And I can comment on the difference between Shenzhen entrepreneurs and the Silicon Valleys. That I agree with what Greg said, that Chinese entrepreneurs are more short-term, and they aim for short-term goals. I think it's mostly driven by their VC fundings, and the VCs want to return in within 1 or 2 years. Instead of Silicon Valley, you can have 5-year horizon. So that is one reason. And Silicon Valley entrepreneurs has a much better support in terms of ecosystem in Silicon Valley. And they can afford to have visionaries, say VCs, on their board or to fund them so that they can take time to do it. My failed one startup actually stayed in business for 6 years before we fold. So it has some horizon in front of it. But on the other hand, the Chinese entrepreneurs are more driven. And someone earlier in today's panel talked about the 996, the model. And the entrepreneurs, the co-founders are working much longer than 996. But the average employees are working on 996 if they are become a part of the startup environment. They want to have a piece of ownership. So that, of course, they may not have the experience and the higher quality that Silicon Valley have. But they make up by their education level, as Jack mentioned, they make up by numbers. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason, on first hand, I can see the innovation from China side. I will no longer talk about made in China. I'm talking about innovation China side is fast, rapidly catching up with Silicon Valley.
Well said, actually, and I can speak from a personal experience as well. I actually hosted the richest woman from China just not too long ago. This is share the same last name as me, Wu Yajun, Yajun Wu. She actually is the founder and chairman of Longford, Longhu. And actually, I hosted her for pretty much a whole half a day. I spent the whole afternoon with her, like pretty much from 2 all the way to 6, 7 o'clock. And you know what she did, which really shocked me? Right afterward, she spent about another additional 3 hours. Now, this is a multi-billionaire, the richest woman, self-made billionaire from China. And she spent an extra 3 hours that evening interviewing students at UC Berkeley, and ultimately giving about 20, 30 offers to these students. If you ask, and of course I met Mark Zuckerberg, before. I mean, these are great entrepreneurs. But if you ask any typical, successful entrepreneurs, the question is, would they do that? Would they do that? That's a big question mark on that. These are people who actually, have done it. She doesn't have to do it, but because why? Because she treasures talent. She wants to hire the best people into her firm. She knows that those days were actually based on just low labor, low intensity, that kind of thing is over. It's really about talent as well. So they're really emphasizing a lot of, putting a lot of time investing in talents as well. So you guys are right on. Thank you very much for sharing that. That's actually sort of at the individual level. But let's look at a structural level, meaning that really sort of difference between perceptions and realities, or what are the differences between sort of the support structures, right, available to startups, corporations, both in U.S. versus that of U.S. But Dan, why don't you comment on that?
I'll just make a top-down point that it's quite a different political system. The Chinese government managed to create the world's largest wind market for wind turbines at the stroke of a pen through government procurement. And because most Chinese provinces are about as large EU countries, you could have enough internal competition to generate fairly competitive wind firms. This is the same strategy for doing electric vehicles, mostly through sticks and carrots. China's created the world's largest market for electric vehicles. And it's a different question of which of these firms will be competitive, but it is just, if you have this government mandate to actually have to work on these technologies and create the market over there, this can create a lot of opportunities for pulling forward technologies that may not have existed if this was just all left to the market.
Great.
Yeah, similarly, the government support is amazing at both the local district city level, the city level, the federal level. I've been to dozens of makerspaces in China that have nobody in them because they're all government funded. There's definitely a focus on creativity in China, I think. Similarly with this makerspace, this very grassroots level innovation. And we work with governments all over the world that look at supporting hardware, and probably the U.S. offers the least support of any country that I've been to. And that makes us more competitive, which is very interesting because you have to be able to compete without government money. I think too, here in Silicon Valley especially, we take for granted that we're willing to share ideas. You could go to a meetup group every night of the week and meet entrepreneurs, and they'll often share your ideas. I think Mark Zuckerberg had a party every Saturday to share the latest and get feedback. And that is very different in China. That you don't share your ideas openly very often. If you do, it's in a controlled way. And that really hampers the speed of innovation. It does also control your IP a little bit better.
And Jack?
Like Greg mentioned, I've been to makerspaces in China that are empty in Shenzhen. When I started my career, we didn't really have those. You just do a startup company, especially in software, it's fairly straightforward. You get a room, you buy some computers and put some desks in there or tables, and you hire staff or recruit staff. Hardware is different. Requires much more capital to do that, and VC firms are not, they don't like investing in hardware, and the fact that Oculus, we could do that, lies greatly in my boss's ability to sell things. But it's really tough to get venture capital people that are interested in hardware. It's very risky and very high cost. And I'll give you another story here. At Oculus, we had $1.2 million that's what we started the company with, plus capital from myself and other people. And we couldn't find a contract manufacturer because we're too small, and they all thought it was a weird thing. So we had to get our contract manufacturer to buy in with a deposit, a $750,000 deposit to produce 10,000 pieces, and then we should be paid when they're finished it. And that's a relationship thing that I built. We didn't have a makerspace. We didn't have a 3D printer at the company. We had none of that stuff. We had to do it over there, and we sent the models out, and they were printed on a liquid printer. They were shipped back to us. That's kind of the model I'm familiar with. But now things have changed, and I learned from people. I learned from young people. They were apt to buy a 3D printer, which I promptly bought when I retired. And they're apt to do those kinds of things and make the circuit boards domestically and put everything together. So, I learned from people, and that's one of the things I learned. So Berkeley has Skydeck. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's on Shattuck Avenue. It's a incubator makerspace, and the university gets a piece of the action. That's why they're doing it. And not in my career did we use makerspace. It was generally, a startup was done. I had a camera company that I started and failed, but basically just did it ad hoc and with the lowest cost we could do. Just trying to save money. So that was my experience, though.
Yeah. So Jack, I think you point out a really important point, which is, and this is actually not only China is doing. Actually, as a student of sort of studying the East Asian economic development model, you actually see that a lot of the other Asian countries, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, that a lot of the things that like she said, the capitalist society doesn't necessarily invest money or time in it, and the government decided that they actually have to invest in the basic infrastructure, to set this up. So this is not anything new that in terms of like some of the things that China does. They're really kind of following the studies of what other models have done, including Japan, obviously. We know the industrial policy in Japan. So a lot of these things are nothing new. It's just being talked about, because of the trade war situation. But actually, on the most sensitive side, which is kind of part two of what we're getting into, is about U.S. China fight on IP issues. So on that kind of thing, especially on technology transfer and licensing, I want actually Yongwei to talk a little bit more about that. How does China, from your perspective, you've seen, having both worked U.S. and China, acquire technology from overseas, or how does, sort of compare U.S. and China from that perspective, please?
So I can only speak about my experience in BGI. BGI is not an SOE, it's 100% owned by the co-founders of the BGI Group, a private health company. So when they have been in the genomics field for more than 20 years, when they saw opportunity like in complete genomics, which a typical Silicon Valley startup went to on NASDAQ, but they saw that this technology has potential, but it's not as great as other competing technologies. Both of those companies are based in California, and that's the reason the complete genomics stock was dropping on NASDAQ. They saw the opportunity. They believe that, okay, here's the opportunity. We can acquire technology, then do our own innovation. Because without innovation, they know this technology is not market competitive. So BGI spent $120 million to acquire complete genomics. Then since 2013, they spent another $500 million in the innovation investing both in the complete genomics side, which is in San Jose, I'm based in, and also in Shenzhen. And they build like a 1,000 person team combined to continue to do innovation. So right now, our BGI sequencing platform technology is, in my own view, is at the same or better than the dominant market player right now. So we have been, for example, last week in JP Morgan conference, we announced that we shipped 1,000 instruments. We announced a product that has a leading performance in the world. And those are the China innovations. Although we still do manufacturing in China, of course, we still make in China, but the innovation are purely due to the commitment and the investment and the talents from across the Pacific.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Basically, there's actually, yes, in the past, they're really lacking behind in terms of the innovation, but I think peer number right now. We're talking about actually my good friend is the chairman of the largest law firm in China, or Asia now, King & Wood. And actually he did a presentation where, of course, let's not necessarily look at quality yet, but in terms of quantity, China has caught up. Of course, they have a lot to do. They still have a lot to do in terms of quality, but in terms of pure number of quantity of IPs that's filed, China is leading. And we just learned from the previous speakers. Actually, my good friend used to be CEO of ZTE. Huawei, those guys are really having the largest IP portfolio now as well. So on those pure numbers, they're really, innovating. At least at that level. Of course, they have to improve on the quality of their pens. But over time, that's going to happen. Over time, that's going to happen. So actually, that's really kind of going down to the part 3 of and sort of the closing part, and we'll leave time for Q&A. I want you guys to comment on, what are the from your perspective, one do and don'ts for growing business in both U.S. and China under the current political climate, please. Jack?
I did all the don'ts, so.
The do's.
Yeah, I can tell you from experience how to deal with a different culture. And when I first went over there, I was told that I was like a cow, and that I barged in, and so then the feedback I got was you have to show some humility and shrink yourself down a little bit, which I did, and that's when things started to work for me. My experience is that it's based on relationships, and I befriended important people when I needed to get something done, and it was genuine. I genuinely liked them. Some of them they're okay, but I generally liked the people, and I got invited to weddings, family parties, it went on and on, and then when I needed something done, like in the case of Oculus, with no market and no money, I can get it done. So that's my experience. I maintain those relationships, not so much now, but over the years, staying in touch with people, staying in contact with people, and asking them how their family's doing. And then things happen. When I did those things and shrunk myself down a little bit, stuff started to work. But it was a learning experience. And how to pass that on to someone else, you just have to learn trial and error.
Right. Well said. Actually, Greg, why don't you comment on that, and then I want to ask the closing question for the other two people. Greg, please.
Yeah, I think getting back to understanding the culture, and I'd say kind of at the high level and the low level. So as a business, if you're looking to get into China, I think you have to have some understanding of the culture. You have to know what to do, what not to do. And it's hard. It takes years. I'm still learning. I've been living there 14 years, and I'm still learning every day. And it's always changing, too. That's one thing about what you know now in China will be different in 3 months. So you have to keep up to speed. The easiest way to jump into that, I would say, would be to hire or work with a partner that you really trust, that is on the ground, that knows how to develop those relationships and work within the ecosystem. At the government level, I think we've been talking about reciprocity and synergy, and I think there's a lot of ways that the U.S. and China have great synergy. I think we have great creative outside-the-box thinking as far as innovation. China has great process innovation, down at the machine level, and getting those together is really powerful. Where it falls apart is AI. We have a inherent belief in personal, there's personal rights, and China is very different. You kind of give up your personal rights for the good of society. So when those conflict, we really need to understand those and be very careful.
Right, well said. And I think we're all human beings at the end of the day. Humans are humans. There's the trust factor, the human factor, the interaction factor. So well said, both of you. Last question, and I hope you guys can answer in 30 seconds because we want to leave for a few minutes for people. It's in the long term, China is not going away and will only get stronger in the manufacturing base as an economy. How should both U.S. and China work together to make this a win-win partnership? Yongwei.
So one of the panelists talked about earlier today is about he sees the distrust between two sides. I agree that's the main reason. If we can encourage people to communicate more, to visit each other more, that will improve a lot. And I personally see the experience that the San Jose employee went to China, they completely open their eyes. And the Chinese people come here, they open their eyes. That will build the trust.
Right, Dan?
I'll answer the do and don't question. What you should do is study what the Chinese entrepreneurs are up to and how they respond to market conditions, and don't violate U.S. export control laws.
Well said. And let's leave time for Q&A. Yes, that lady right in purple. Yes,
Just
please.
a quick question this time about automobiles. Dan, you mentioned that you're cautiously optimistic about semiconductors, but I wonder how you feel about AVs. People tend to view that China is doing very well in EVs, but the talk about AVs is subject to debate. And it seems in my mind that it's driven by whether or not it's going to be the US dominating through sheer hardware capabilities or China through execution and supportive infrastructure like sensors on posts and cities that are completely AV friendly. So if I'd like to get any kind of feedback.
Will you answer that from supply chain? Because obviously, you know.
Oh, yeah, I'm probably not the right guy for that.
Not enough expertise. I'll push it off to Yongwei.
Great comment on that.
Was the question on
Automobile?
electric vehicles?
AVs.
Autonomous, yeah.
Oh.
Autonomous.
I would just say there is a huge advantage by having the national government, right? That you can implement things at a city level for 1 billion people at a speed that we can not compete with here in any sense. So as far as that supports the technology, I think China has a big advantage. As far as where that is right now, and I'm not involved in that space as much.
Two more last questions. One, right, go ahead. My fellow 21 friend, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So speaking of chips, one of the reasons why it's so hard to displace a chip maker like Intel is the ecosystem that's actually built on the architecture. How is China progressing in terms of actually being viable, create an ecosystem in addition to all the investments that you've talked about?
Not great. I think that Chinese chip has to be better by an order of magnitude of either cost or performance, and even to kick in that ecosystem effect, and it's not there yet.
All right, so actually I want to, I don't see any last dying questions or oh no, I'm sorry. You actually, one last question over there. Sorry.
I'm all the way over here. I'm going to take a slightly different direction. So I guess question for Jack and potentially also Yongwei. I like that you mentioned education. So what is something that you think the US could learn from China as far as implementing tech and these kinds of new ideas in earlier education?
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on the way China educates people. I will comment on okay, there's a parental difference and a cultural difference in the way that children perceive education from Chinese families and American families. It's just the way it is. In the 70s, I went to school, high school in the 70s, I'm old, but we had a very good education system here, and I was pretty well prepared for college. I was ready to go. And now, they have to go to junior college to get caught up for the stuff they didn't learn. How to change that, the cultural part is challenging. But there have been two watermark pieces of legislation that occurred that really affected California education. That was Prop 13, which removed funding from the local level to the state level. Now the state's in charge of providing funds to the school system. The second one was the changing in the way that accreditation occurred for teachers in the 90s, and that's when it fell off a cliff. So the quality of teachers declined, and now they're hard to get rid of. So I'm talking about K through 12. On the higher education, the universities, we're number 4 in the country, and we've got some of the best universities in California. I don't live here, but you guys do, in California. So to answer your question, there has to be a way in the accreditation system and changing the funding back to the local level where the school board determines what they need, not a bureaucrat in Sacramento. That's kind of what happened.
You wait 30 seconds.
This topic will take me 3 hours to address. I will skip for now.
That was 30 seconds.
Okay, so I want to end with, actually, since we're in Stanford territory and I'm a Berkeley graduate, actually I have to make a comment that actually my friend Dave Patterson, and of course another friend of mine, John Hennessy, the former Stanford president, they won the Turing Award. And so, of course what it says is really, and by the way, they invented something called, WIS5, and that naming was actually due to Berkeley, so it's owed to Berkeley. But I want to make a comment that about actually quoted a friend of mine, Fei Li, right, which is a well-known distinguished professor here at computer science at Stanford. She actually made a comment, which I think really, at the end, sort of really kind of help us to understand sort of this U.S.-China situation in the area of AI. Her comment was, the science of AI actually has no borders, neither do its benefits. In other words, whether a breakthrough occurs in Silicon Valley, Beijing, or anywhere else, it has the potential to make everyone's life better for the entire world. So in other words, what we're saying is, we continue to work. I think obviously, ultimately, we leave the politics to the politicians, but as practitioners, as entrepreneurs, and as investors, I think that we need to continue to work of collaborations between the two nations. Thank you.